we have to make sure that you have all the assumption here and all the information about what's happened to the tax system during that period. And here, the elasticity approach is defined as the ratio of the percentage change on your tax revenue to the percentage change on the tax base, meaning the growth rate of your tax revenue by the growth rate of the tax base. And here we assume that no change in the tax system had occurred during this period. Okay? And for example, here it could be the GDP as the proxy of your tax base or the proxy of your tax base. So here I want to please that you focus on this. The assumption that you have here on the formula is about no policy change, adjustment of revenue. There is no change in the system during this period. And you will see that when we have information about any adjustment, we need to take that adjustment to calculate correctly the elasticity. We will see it on the next slides. So to conclude on that slide is that an estimate of the elasticity can be obtained by rule averaging of the ratio of the percentage change in revenue to the percentage change in the tax base over the period. Last comment here is that I highlighted this. I wanted to repeat it because this is very important for the remaining of the lecture, but also during the workshop, we will have an exercise on this. So here we have an assumption in the formula about no policy change. No policy change in terms of the tax system. But if needed be, we have to make some adjustments in the revenue to make them correspond to the no change scenario. We will assume that if I have information that a change happened on the tax system, we have to adjust the tax revenue that we have to calculate correctly the elasticity. And this is, we will see it then through a methodology with an example. One thing I want to highlight is that if we have the elasticity is equal to 1, we will see it later as well, is that we can simply assume that you are using the effective tax rate approach, and the elasticity can give us the same result. Otherwise, we will have a difference. For example, if we know that the revenue are growing 1/1 to the change of the tax base, the elasticity approach and the effective tax rate give us the same result. Otherwise, if this is not the case, so if this is not one-on-one, so we can use, and it is better to use the elasticity as the best forecast and the best measures. Other things important here to highlight is that the elasticity approach allows revenue to grow faster or more slowly than the tax base, and we will see it if it is upper than 1 or lower than 1. Okay, so now in concrete manner, I have to admit something that a precise estimate is very hard to obtain here, because we can have some statistical discrepancies, and we can also suffer from a not full coverage of data. So, and sometimes this information are mainly based on same country experience, and if you have to compare country with other with the same income economic structure, because elasticity cannot be only one number, it could be also a range of number, and we have to calculate and to have information about elasticity on different tax category. But that means that even though we have this information, the judgment is very important to make the forecast using elasticity. So in practical manner, how can I use the elasticity to make the forecast of tax revenue? So your tax revenue is equal to 1 plus the elasticity times the growth rate of the tax base. This part gives us the growth rate of your tax revenue. So we have 1 plus the growth rate of your tax revenue times the tax revenue over the last period, which give us the forecast of the tax revenue at period T. Is there any question so far here? Fabrice?
C'est bon, c'est bon.
Okay. Here it's an application again, with the same example, the same data. So here, again, we have the forecast of the tax base, which is the import for 2017. We have data from 2014 until 2016 on import duties, I mean, tax revenue and import and import value. So what we can do here, we can first calculate the elasticity, applying probably the formula that you have, which is the growth rate of the tax revenue divided by the growth rate of your import, which is the tax base. So it gives us an elasticity equal probably to 0.6, which is 0.7 as we get on the previous slide on the marginal tax rate. So then what we can do, we can calculate the import collected from the the tax collected from the import in 2017, which is 1 plus the elasticity that we get here times the growth rate of your import. This gives us the growth rate of your tax revenue from import in 2017 times the import duties that we collected in 2016, which give us 169, which is almost 170. And if can we go back, it's almost, particularly the not so far from the results. Okay. I want first to present you some rule of thumb, which I found them relevant in making some judgment about, I mean, the elasticities that we will see. First of all, I highlighted this previously. When my elasticity is equal to 1, I mean, here there is no difference between your elasticity and the effective tax rate. And this occurs when the tax rate is proportional rather than progressive. I mean, this when the tax is levied on ad valorem basis, and when there is no significant lag in the collection. That means that your tax administration is working properly and running properly to collect taxes. The other case is that, but here we can raise a question. You said, okay, what if, why I am using this? Why I am using the elasticity? The answer is short. So the elasticity approach here, just to keep that in my mind and in your mind, is that it can be valuable when the data are suggesting that there is a nonlinear response of revenue to the proxy. Meaning what? Meaning that the elasticity that you get is different from 1. It could be higher than 1, and this is the case when the tax rate is based on a progressive tax structure. Think about, I mean, personal income taxes, and particularly if the tax structure is not indexed on for inflation. Also, it will be the case when your elasticity is lower than 1. Think, for example, about consumption and the consumption taxes. And this is possible for some specific taxes. Who can give me an example other that you can get the elasticity lower than 1? Not Ian, of course. I will let Ian at the last resort. Huh?
Bon, la TVA?
Where? What else? Great.
The elasticity depends on the type of tax system, right?
Yeah.
certaines taxes d'assises.
Très bien, les assises. Les assises sur les cigarettes, sur le tabac, pardon, sur le tabac, sur autre chose. Yeah. Quoi d'autre? What else?
Je ne compte plus.
Value added tax.
Ok, ok. Hubert, vous avez une remarque à faire? Okay, now Ian, we can give us an example. Just to close the loop. You are muted, Ian.
Yeah, so it really the elasticity depends on a number of factors.
Yes.
And a critical the example of certain goods in particular is quite interesting. The one on tobacco I've liked for years because it demonstrated in some countries that they're exploiting the inelasticity of demand for certain goods, like tobacco, for example, such that the excise increase each year was empirically determined over time, such that when it was increased, if the government's interest was more in terms of revenue optimization rather than actually trying to dissuade people from using a particular good, or service, they would increase the excise duty to just below the point at which demand would be impacted, or alternatively at a point such that you picked the peak in revenue and trading off that revenue peak with any impact in demand. It was only when you had teetotal, non-smoking, highly focused ministers and cabinets involved, where they would actually want to really crunch demand and not worry too much about the revenue raised. So the point being in all of this, you can actually dial up exactly what you want it to be when you've got an inelastic good or service that you're taxing, because you can play games quite nicely. And it's cruel, I think, myself. But anyway, that's the point I wanted to talk about.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, makes sense. It makes sense. It makes sense. So in general, the elasticity can decline with high inflation. It could be due to the compliance, lags, specific rates. Think about taxes on property, land taxes that have an elasticity with respect to the nominal GDP of less than 1. Why? Because, for example, we have some issues on the reassessment of the tax base each time. That leads to the elasticity below 1. This is another typically example that in top of what Ian highlighted previously. Now, just to summarize this.
Just one other minor point. This is on income taxes in particular.
Yeah.
Right. And especially when you've got inflation, high inflation rates, and the fiscal drag that occurs by not changing the tax brackets, then because of inflation, incomes rise, and you get the people breaking through tax bracket boundaries. So actually being impacted by effectively higher tax rates, even
Yeah.
though their real incomes may have actually fallen.
Declined, of course. Yeah.
So, and that's another nice game.
Just to clarify here, you mean?
Hello, hello.
Yeah.
May I please chip in?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, it's Carousel from Botswana. Like in the case of my country,
Yeah.
we imposed an alcohol levy, tax levy of 70%,
Yeah.
but it didn't affect the spending. So it was reduced to 30%. So right now it's still at 30%, and still the spending hasn't reduced on alcohol. So I think that's the same case as you're saying.
But this
that's
this is in elasticity that Ian was mentioning. So yeah, I mean, people like to drink alcohol. They have the right to do it. So you increase it, so they will still spending their money on this. So there is no impact. And just to clarify what Ian is saying on the wage on the personal income tax is that inflation is up, so the revenue is increasing because they got also an increase relative to there is an indexation, right? Ian, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah,
with the inflation, but which leads to more taxes to be levied on this. However, on real terms, the revenue are declining, which is a bit problematic for population. Yeah, so just when we have a tax system which is the tax system is more likely is to be elastic, it's the case that your elasticity is higher than 1, meaning that your revenue are growing faster than your tax base. And this is the case when the tax are levied on growing economic sectors. The tax are progressive, as highlighted by the tax rate are ad valorem than at specific. Who can give me an example of what we mean by ad valorem taxes?
Typiquement, c'est la TVA.
Yeah, but ok, c'est la TVA, mais comment elle est appliquée? But
Yeah, can I come in somewhere?
yes, yeah, come in, please.
A valorem tax is a form of tax system in which the percentage is levied on the price of the commodity based on its value.
Great. That's as I want to sound. It's the value instead of the quantity of the size. Okay, great. Okay, and the last thing is that taxes are collected promptly, which is the efficiency of the tax administration to collect the taxes promptly. Now, remember, when we discussed the elasticity, we made the assumption, which is strong assumption, that there is no change on the tax system, right? Now, when the tax system, has changed over time, and there is no good way to estimate the revenue effect of those change, we can estimate the buoyancy using the actual revenue as opposed here to what you have mentioning previously, no change in the tax scenario used for the elasticity. So here the buoyancy is the percentage change in actual revenue divided by the percentage change in the tax base. Here, for example, you can take the GDP. Okay, meaning what? Meaning that your buoyancy reflects both the elasticity of the tax system and any change in the tax system that occurred through a discretionary action by the tax administration. So some important stuff here, just to clarify for those who are more specialized than me working at tax administration, is that the elasticity and the buoyancy are used for not only for projection, but also for the analysis of the degree of tax revenue responsiveness to the change in the tax base. They allow also to analyze the effect of reforms on revenue mobilization. We will have a lecture on revenue mobilization with Ian, if I'm not wrong, is not tomorrow, Ian, is on Friday. And this is also, I mean, looking at buoyancy and elasticity is also very important. Why? Because these two concepts allow us to see what is the ultimate trigger of revenue changes. Is that due to automatic change resulting from the tax-based dynamic, okay, or due, as I highlighted on the buoyancy side, due to the discretionary policy action? So here, to summarize, the buoyancy compared to the elasticity is based on the actual revenue and not under the hypothesis that there is no change on the tax administration system. Is there any question so far before I move on? Is that clear? I saw a question on the chat. Okay. Okay, now the other approach is to use regression. I mean, some interference of econometric exercise. The first one is to use, I mean, if you want to forecast your tax revenue, you can use the following, the first estimation we have here. So we can regress your tax revenue on the GDP, which is the forecast of your tax base. Also, and on your past tax revenue, and also on your past tax base, which is the GDP. That's the first one. The second approach is we can estimate the buoyancy by making the following regression your tax revenue based on the forecast of your tax base. And here, beta 1 is your buoyancy. And here, as I highlighted previously, the buoyancy coefficient here reflects both the elasticity of the tax system and any change in the tax system, right? That's I want you please to keep in mind. Now, what's happened if the tax system have changed over the period? The first one is if I have information based on historical data, this is something that we can use and we can detect. Otherwise, let's say I have an idea when the change had occurred. And what we can use an econometric regression using a dummy variables, which the dummy is reflecting the year when the change happened to the tax system, right? And here, similarly to the previous one, when we are estimating the elasticity, so the beta here is the estimation of your elasticity. Otherwise, there is another method which is based on what we call it the proportional adjustment approach. So what we do here, we adjust the actual or historical data, tax data, on assumption that if the tax change has occurred earlier, previous year's revenue would have been also changed by the same percentage. Any question? So let me repeat this. Let's say we know that some change happened due to the data, happened to earlier to the tax system. So if this is happened earlier, we made the assumption that previous year's revenue also would have been changed by the same percentage. And that's in that way we can calculate and we can modify and adjust your tax revenue using the proportional adjustment approach. And this will help us distinguishing between the buoyancy and the elasticity. By adjusting the tax, we can calculate the elasticity properly. If we don't have information, we make the assumption that we cannot do anything, but keep in mind that you are calculating a buoyancy, which is reflecting both elasticity and the discretionary change happen to the tax system. Is that clear? So here, what I can tell you, and this is my only opinion, and I don't know if Anna and Ian agree with me, is that it is difficult to separate the effect of change in tax rate and the base of tax revenue. So sometimes calculating the elasticity is more difficult as compared to buoyancy. I don't know if you agree with me, but this is my personal view. Any questions so far? Okay, this is an example about how to use a proportional adjustment approach. We will have a beautiful example during the workshop that we focus on this, but let me give you the stage and the flavor to understand a bit better now. Let's have this configuration about our actual revenue. I'm saying actual revenue from year 1 to year 5. Okay, and we assume that the discretionary change occurred only on year 2 and year 4. So what we can do here is that we can calculate the effect of the discretionary action in year 4 by calculating the ratio between your actual revenue, and this is what you said, the incidence, and the adjusted, not the revenue adjusted, but the revenue adjusted from the discretionary measure. So this gives us an idea that the discretionary action in year 4 was to raise the revenue collection in that year by 13.6%. Similarly, the effect on the year 2 was to raise revenue in that year by 16.7%. Now, how are you going to adjust? Remember, so we are saying that if both discretionary action have been taken at the beginning of the data period, the revenue series will have become as follow under the assumption of, because you have to adjust what's happened in earlier should have happened on previous years. So here, the 13.6% should be applied to the revenue on year 3. So instead of that, so therefore, this is the actual revenue. So the adjusted revenue will be 170 multiplied by the raise of the revenue in that year, which is supposed to be occurred. So similarly, on year 2, so what's happened here will apply it on year 2 as well. So we have a new revenue adjusted. And for year 1, what's happened in year 3 and year 2 will be applied for year 1, and these give us a new revenue or the revenue adjusted. We will see an exercise during the workshop. I think, yeah, during the workshop, I mean, how to calculate the revenue adjusted through the proportional adjustment approach. Any questions so far? Okay. This is we can. So the question is, what to do to forecast tax revenue? So first of all, the elasticity approach can be valuable when the data are suggesting a nonlinear relationship or nonlinear response of revenue to the proxy of tax base, meaning that having an elasticity different from 1. If the elasticity is equal to 1, it's same results than the effective tax rate. So, but broadly speaking, what you need to know is that to make the choice between the two approaches, we have to consider what data are available, the information about the change on the tax code, on the tax system. What about the tax rate, the exemption, the structure of the tax base, the structural change on the tax base. And also, don't forget your judgment. Sometimes you know your country much better than others, so this is very important. So if you lack information, you have to use the buoyancy, but you have to apply the result very carefully and conservatively. However, for smaller items, such as, for example, tax on property, non-tax revenue, what you have to do, look at the past ratio and then watch for the stability of this ratio. So we can say, okay, let me use, for example, the effective tax rate or applying the same ratio to GDP to make the forecast. What we should do for forecasting other revenue? If you want to forecast other non-tax revenue, we can do it by extrapolating its trend or by calculating its ratio to GDP. This is if they are small and there is no impact in terms of total tax revenue. However, if they are significant, let's say, for example, the fee to government from oil exploration or the profit from public enterprise, here we have to be careful. First off, you have to study the determinant of each revenue sources and then try to quantify any such relationship to make your forecast. I mean, it's not something that we can do it as considering that is small because they have a very significant effect. Any questions so far? C'est clair? J'entends personne. I'm not hearing anyone. Are you here, guys?
Yes, I have, Mr.
Oui.
Thank you, Samuel. Is that clear?
I'm sorry that I want to take it back a little bit.
Sorry?
When you had the regression specification,
Yeah.
the GDP and the tax lack one period.
Yeah.
So which one is the mean variable there? No, the next. Okay, good. Yeah.
Here.
I mean, the GDP today and GDP last year. So
Yeah.
which one is the mean variable here?
Which variable is what?
Which one is the focus variable here? Is it tax like one period or GDP at 20?
I get your point. So if you want to take the dynamic, your coefficient on your elasticity should be the sum of beta 1 plus beta 3, right?
Yeah.
If you want to take the ancestral effect, you took beta 1.
So what I want to understand is that.
Sorry?
20, right? Tax at 20.
Yeah.
Is a function of GDP at 20 and tax at 20 like one period.
Okay,
here at GDP.
Here
so
you have.
Yeah,
because here you have
tax revenue to the.
Be careful here. Be careful. Here, there is, okay, because you are saying you have an endogeneity effect, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not something perfect. So you can correct your estimation. If you thought that this approach is not optimal from an econometric point of view, so you can make some tests, you can use instead the second one. You know, the second one, which is you make the assumption that after forecasting your GDP, you can calculate your buoyancy. But here, keep in mind that your buoyancy is including the elasticity of the tax system and any change of the tax system. And that's why we are saying if there is no broadly information, focus on the second one. Is that clear, Samuel?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Anytime. Anytime. So I think for sake of time, just for 5 minutes, did anyone can tell me what approach have been used on your country to forecast revenue and how this method are performing? Or we can take this question for when we will discuss, revenue mobilization with Ian. I think it's much better. We can open the stage. I have only 10 minutes to, right, Ian? Doesn't make sense for you? Okay. Any volunteers so far?
Oui, je peux prendre la parole, hein?
Oui, Fabrice, allez-y.
Bon, généralement, nous ici en RDC, par rapport au modèle de prévision que nous utilisons pour les recettes, c'est un modèle qui se focalise plus sur la méthode des élasticités. Sur la méthode des élasticités, chaque année, nous faisons un effort de réestimer les paramètres et les élasticités pour les actualiser en fonction des évolutions des statistiques. Et généralement, les écarts de prévision sont vraiment très faibles, en tout cas par expérience. On n'a pas encore eu à comparer avec d'autres méthodes, malheureusement. Généralement, c'est plus focalisé sur cette méthode-là. Et généralement, on n'a pas ces problèmes de cas de prévision. C'est vraiment minime.
OK. OK. Thank you. Thank you, Fabrice. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. OK. Now, after saying, we have seen how to forecast revenue, we will look at the expenditure side. So here, what I want you to understand is that because many decisions about government expenditure are political in nature, there is less scope for relying on economic relationship in forecasting the level of government expenditure than in forecasting that of revenue. So broadly speaking here, the expenditure can be divided into two categories. So we have, in the one hand, we have the discretionary expenditure or discretionary category, which is decided from year to year. And this is mainly through the budget. It depends on, it can be increased or decreased in the short run, and it can be estimated on the basis of decision made by policymakers, as reflected, for example, on the budget document. How you have also, on the other hand, the non-discretionary category, which are fixed in the short term and cannot be changed. For example, you have the interest rate, you have the social security payment, such as the employment benefit, the pension. Here we have to distinguish between these two categories, something that we can change and the other we cannot change. But also many discretionary expenditure can reflect also some macroeconomic development. Think about the capital expenditure, which depends on the projection of your growth, the prospect of your inflation, the exchange rate, depends also of the availability of the external financing. All these kind of things can have an impact on these categories. So now, more precisely, so to forecast the discretionary expenditure, we have to look first at the budget, the approved budget by the policymaker. But keep in mind that sometimes this budget has an upper limit on expenditure, on the one hand, and the other hand, during a year, if any event could happen, a supplementary budget can sometimes be added. But what you have to look first is we have to pay attention to the pre-announced change of the fiscal policy in the country. is the fiscal policy is going to be loosening or tightening. If we don't have any information about the government discretionary policy measure, so we can forecast the discretionary expenditure on the basis of existing policy. So in that case, we assume that this policy will remain unchanged over the forecast period. And as a first approximation, we can involve maintaining past ratio to GDP. So broadly speaking, what we can do here is to forecast your expenditure in time t, depending on your expenditure on time t minus 1 times the growth rate of your nominal GDP. So therefore, what you need to have as an information, we need to have data on inflation and data on the growth, the GDP rate growth, and also the expenditure. I saw a hand raised.
Yes, it was me, Carousel.
Yeah,
You answered
Carissa.
the question. You answered the question that I wanted to ask.
Really, because I read that on your mind, you know, it's a bit of magic. Okay.
It is. Thank you.
Okay. So that being said, we will see on the workshop that for other main categories, for example, like the wage and salaries, to make the forecast depends on, for example, let's say we want to forecast the wage bill. It depends on the information that you have about the number of the employee in the country, and also is there any institutional reform in the government sector. We can also have information or assumption about the wage rate, which can be forecasted using inflation and GDP growth. For other categories, for example, like subsidies, grant, social benefit, and other like capital transfer, here we have to keep in mind something, is that when you have a program that is put in place, it is very difficult to shrink or eliminate, like the subsidies, for example, for political reason, or for example, during like a recession, or like, for example, as Anna highlighted in the first lecture, due to the war now in Europe, I mean, some agri-food commodities are going up, which could raise like a food security problem in some countries, in our region in particular. So the government cannot, I mean, shrink subsidies that already have been put in place for this reason. There is also another I mean, characteristic is that such categories of spending depends on the government policy. It depends also on the rate growth of the real GDP. It depends also on the rate growth of the population covered by the program. For example, for the capital expenditure, it depends also on, we have to think that this is something we cannot turn it off and on easily, because the capital spending in most of country is set in the context of a multi-year investment program, and it is then subject to the annual change in light of resource constraint, for example, but we cannot turn it like this directly. It depends on how much external financing I had, the exchange rate, the price of import, so on and so forth. So if we don't have such information, what we can do, so we can consider maintaining past ratio to GDP, as I highlighted previously for the category, for the overall, I mean, expenditure. Now, one of the category is, I mean, we have discussing here about non-interest expenditure. What about interest payment? To forecast interest payment, what we need to know? We need to know that we need to know the interest rate and the average stock of debt in each category. So in most cases, the applicable interest rate is easy to find out, or you can make assumption about market reaction and risk premia, depending on the development of the primary balance. So here, what we have on the slide is the way that we are forecasting interest payment through the financial programming exercise. I think many of you get a chance to meet with Anna previously and Ian through this exercise. There is a way to do it through the financial programming, which, as I highlighted, we forecast the interest on existing and new debt separately. So for the existing debt, we apply an average interest rate to the stock of outstanding debt. Let's say the debt at year T-1 at the end should be the debt of the starting year. Then what we can do, we have to forecast the interest on foreign debt and domestic debt separately. However, here we have an issue. The issue is that when we want to forecast the interest rate for the new debt, we have what we said like a circularity issue or a simultaneous problem, because the interest rate payment changed the balance, and in turns changing the balance change the financing need and then the amount of the new debt. So there is like an iteration process until we reach a reasonable stability. I put for you on the lecture here the steps that have been used on the financial programming to calculate this, how we can project the interest payment. But nevertheless, and this is a question that I wanted to ask you, in reality, the assumption based on, to do that, we know that any government should know the borrowing plan, and therefore, policy, economists knows what is exactly the plans of debt issuance, what are the plans for amortization, debt repayment. Having both information can give us a forecast of the debt path, and knowing the debt path, we can calculate the interest payment. So I think I'm done here. Just I want to brainstorm and benefiting from your experience. Can someone give us explaining some method done to forecast expenditure as done for revenue? Fabrice. Vous êtes là? Not only Fabrice, everyone. Thank you, Olivier. Are you here, guys? Yes, Kagiso. Go ahead.
Hello again.
Yes, I get.
The forecasting is done in the macro unit.
Yeah.
So we have a medium-term fiscal framework.
Okay.
So for the expenditure part, like you mentioned, we use inflation, and for interest, they use the balance of payments. They have a working group with the Bank of Botswana for balance of payments. So that's where everything is, the forecast is done.
So you mean for the interest payment?
For the interest payments.
But you need the balance of payment to forecast your external financing, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
But
yes,
what about
the macro unit in the ministry works with the Bank of Botswana, for balance of payments to forecast for interest.
Yeah, but when you told me you have a medium-term plan, is there also interrelationship with the debt agency about the government borrowing, the medium-term?
Yes, it does. The debt management office, we do the financing part. We project the how much external debt we are projecting to issue, and domestic debt, and the interest. And for interest, that's where we get the interest rate from them, so we can focus for our interest
payments. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other example? Thank you. Any other? Oui, allez-y. Allô? Okay. Anna?
Well, thank you very much, Karim. I think this is very good. You provided very good basis for our
The workshop.
subsequent work in groups. And remember, then I was going to highlight that our objective of fiscal policy is to evaluate fiscal space if country has enough room for expenditures, and in that regard, making good projection of fiscal variables is very important to make that assessment. So just to a little bit put that in the context, longer term context of our work here. So now, if there are no questions, let's take a 15 minutes break, and then we will go to our group exercises to see how this projection of revenue and expenditure could be done with practical numerical examples. Okay, thank you.
I think Mr. Dessous have a question, and then if I'm not mistaken, Hubert? Okay, I think you had a problem with
connection. I think,
but Hubert is on my workshop, so no problem. I can respond to his question.
Okay.
So Steve, can you put please the timer, and then see you later, Anna and colleagues.
All right, we'll see everybody in a little bit.
How many minutes, Karim?
Anna, 15 minutes, Anna?
Yeah, 15 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. Thank you.